A man who turned hunger into art, sorrow into comedy, and silence into the loudest voice of his century. Stay until the end, because the saddest part of his story is not how he fell. It is what he had to become, just to survive. London in 1889 was not a city for the gentle. Coal smoke clung to the air like a curse, blackening lungs and dreams alike. In the slums of Walworth, children grew old before they grew tall, their childhoods traded for survival. It was here, in a flat above noise and desperation, that Charles Spencer Chaplin was born on April 16. No one in that crumbling neighborhood could have imagined that this fragile infant, wrapped in thin blankets, would one day make kings weep with laughter. But first, he would have to survive being poor in a world that punished poverty like a sin. Charlie's father, Charles Chaplin Sr., was a performer too, a man of stages and spotlights, but also a man consumed by drink. He left before Charlie could remember his face clearly, choosing the bottle over his son. Historians believe the elder Chaplin's addiction was less a choice and more a slow surrender to despair, the same despair that haunted so many performers of that era. Whatever the reason, his absence carved the first wound into young Charlie's life. A wound that would echo through every lonely tramp he later portrayed on screen. Hannah Chaplin was Charlie's whole world. She sang in music halls, her voice trembling with both talent and fragility. She taught Charlie to mimic people on the street, the limp of an old man, the strut of a proud gentleman, turning poverty into a game of imagination. But beneath her warmth lived something fractured. The stress of raising two boys alone, with barely enough food to survive, would soon shatter her mind in ways no child should ever witness. One evening, Hannah's voice failed her on stage, cracking into silence as the crowd grew restless. In a moment historians describe as fate intervening, 5-year-old Charlie was pushed onto the stage to fill the silence. He sang. He danced. The audience, expecting failure, erupted into laughter and applause instead. It was the first taste of something Charlie would chase for the rest of his life, the moment laughter could erase pain, even just for a few minutes. Despite the brief magic of that stage, real life offered no encore. Hannah's mental health worsened. The line between performance and reality blurred inside her mind, until one day, she could no longer separate them. The woman who once sang lullabies began speaking to people who weren't there. The world that should have protected a struggling mother instead prepared to lock her away. Without enough money for food or shelter, Charlie and his brother Sidney were sent to a workhouse, a place historians describe as barely different from a prison for the poor. Cold floors. Strict silence. Children stripped of identity and dignity, treated as burdens rather than human beings. It was here that young Charlie first understood, the world does not pity the poor. It disciplines them. Eventually, Hannah's condition became impossible to hide. She was diagnosed with a severe mental illness and committed to an asylum. Imagine being 7 years old, watching the only person who ever made you feel safe being led away by strangers, unable to even say goodbye properly. That image, his mother disappearing into an institution, never left Charlie. Even decades later, success could not erase it. With no parents to guide him, Charlie was forced to grow up fast. He learned to read people instantly, who was dangerous, who was kind, who could be charmed for a meal. This skill, born from necessity, would later become his greatest artistic gift, an uncanny ability to communicate complex emotions without saying a single word. While other children played carelessly, Charlie observed. He studied drunks stumbling home, dignified men hiding shame, women masking heartbreak with smiles. Every flawed, funny, tragic detail of human behavior became data stored in his mind, data he would later transform into cinema's most beloved character. By his early teens, Charlie joined a clog dancing troupe, then transitioned into comedic stage acts. His talent was undeniable, even to those who underestimated a poor boy from Walworth. Slowly, painfully, opportunity began knocking, not because life became easier, but because Charlie refused to let suffering silence his ambition. In 1910, Chaplin sailed to America as part of a theatrical tour. The new world greeted him with noise, ambition, and a strange kind of hope. It was here, far from the slums of London, that his comedic timing caught the attention of film producers eager to capture his magnetic stage presence on a new, experimental medium, motion pictures. In 1914, Chaplin created the character that would define him forever, the tramp. A man with a tiny mustache, oversized coat, tight jacket, and a cane twirled with quiet defiance. The character was poor, yet dignified. Clumsy, yet noble. Audiences saw themselves in him, people struggling against a world that often refused to be kind. Without dialogue, Chaplin had to communicate sorrow, joy, and longing purely through movement. Every tilt of his hat, every stumble, every glance carried emotional weight. Film historians often note that no other silent performer matched his ability to make audiences laugh and cry within the same scene. By the late 1910s, Chaplin's face was recognized across the globe, a level of fame few humans in history had ever experienced. Children imitated his walk. Factories slowed because workers debated his latest film. Yet behind the curtains of stardom, Chaplin carried the silent burden of a childhood that never truly healed. Chaplin's romantic life became almost as dramatic as his films. He fell deeply, sometimes recklessly, in love, drawn to women much younger than himself, a pattern historians link to his desire to recreate stability he never had as a child. These relationships often ended in heartbreak, scandal, or public controversy, each failure chipping away at the image of the perfect comedic genius. Before we continue, if stories like this move you, press subscribe and tap the bell. Every like tells me to keep digging through history's forgotten wounds, and bringing them back into the light. Despite personal turmoil, Chaplin's professional success soared. In 1919, he co-founded United Artists, gaining unprecedented creative control over his films. For a man who once owned nothing, controlling his own studio was more than business. It was proof that the broken boy from London could conquer an empire built on imagination. Films like The Kid, City Lights, and Modern Times showcased Chaplin's genius, blending humor with devastating emotional depth. In The Kid, audiences watched a storyline eerily similar to his own childhood: poverty, abandonment, and the desperate love between a struggling guardian and a helpless child. As cinema transitioned into sound, many silent stars faded into irrelevance. But Chaplin resisted change, fearing it would destroy the universal language his tramp had built. When he finally spoke on screen in The Great Dictator, his words carried more weight than mere comedy. They became a warning against tyranny rising in Europe. In 1940, Chaplin satirized Adolf Hitler in The Great Dictator, despite immense risk and criticism. He later admitted that had he known the full horror of the Holocaust beforehand, he could not have made comedy from such evil. Yet the film remains a haunting testament to courage through art, daring to mock tyranny while the world still underestimated its danger. As Chaplin grew more vocal about social and political issues, the United States government grew suspicious of his views, branding him as sympathetic to communism during the Cold War's rising paranoia. The same nation that once celebrated him began questioning his loyalty, his morality, and his right to belong. Personal scandals, including paternity lawsuits and accusations regarding his private life, were weaponized against him in the press. Whether fueled by truth, bias, or political agenda, the attacks intensified, turning public admiration into public distrust. In 1952, while traveling abroad, Chaplin's re-entry permit to the United States was revoked. The nation that watched him rise from nothing now refused to let him return. Imagine building your legacy in a place for over 40 years, only to be told you are no longer welcome, not through deportation, but through quiet, devastating exclusion. Chaplin settled in Vevey, Switzerland, finding peace far from Hollywood's chaos. Surrounded by mountains rather than studio lights, he attempted to rebuild a life centered on family rather than fame, though the wound of exile from America never fully closed. In interviews from this period, Chaplin spoke less about cinema and more about humanity, suffering, and resilience. Friends described him as contemplative, often staring into the distance as if revisiting memories from Walworth's cold streets, memories fame could never erase. In 1972, Hollywood extended an apology of sorts, inviting Chaplin back to receive an honorary Academy Award. The standing ovation he received remains one of the longest in Oscar history, a nation finally acknowledging the genius it once rejected. Witnesses say Chaplin wept during that ovation, overwhelmed not just by appreciation, but by decades of unresolved pain finally being witnessed. It was a moment of triumph wrapped tightly around old wounds, proof that recognition, however late, still mattered. Chaplin's influence extended far beyond comedy. He pioneered filmmaking techniques, advocated for workers' rights through his films, and proved that art could critique power without losing its humanity. Modern filmmakers still study his framing, his timing, his ability to make silence speak louder than dialogue. Despite his global fame, Chaplin remained, at his core, the frightened boy who once watched his mother disappear into an asylum. Every triumph seemed shadowed by the fear that happiness was temporary, that suffering could return without warning. Charlie Chaplin passed away on December 25, 1977, surrounded by family in the Swiss home that had become his sanctuary. There was no extravagant farewell, only peace, finally, after a lifetime defined by both unimaginable suffering and unmatched genius. Chaplin once said that life is a tragedy when seen closely, but a comedy when viewed from a distance. Perhaps that single sentence explains his entire existence, a man who transformed his deepest pain into universal joy. His tramp still walks across screens today, reminding us that dignity can survive poverty, that humor can survive heartbreak, and that even the most broken childhood can still create something the whole world learns to love. Maybe that's the real question his life leaves behind: how much of our own pain might still be waiting to become something beautiful, if only we're brave enough to let it.